On the night of February 1, 1959, 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and fled into the Siberian winter at -30 degrees Celsius. Some were barefoot. Some wore only underwear. They did not take their boots, their coats, or their supplies. Within hours, all 9 were dead. The tent was still standing when searchers found it, the snow around it undisturbed except for 9 sets of footprints leading away into the dark. Whatever made them leave had to be so terrifying, or so physically overwhelming, that they chose almost certain death over even a few seconds more inside their only shelter. 65 years later, we still do not have a name for what that was. But we do have the evidence. And the evidence, examined carefully, points somewhere more specific than you might expect. The hikers were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. They were experienced. Several held the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering. Their route through the northern Urals was challenging but well within their capability. On January 28, one member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill and turned back. The remaining 9 continued. This was the last anyone heard from them. When they failed to return by February 12, a search was launched. On February 26, searchers found the tent on the eastern slope of a mountain the local Montsi people called Kholat Syakhl, meaning Dead Mountain. What they found at the tent and what they found in the weeks that followed formed the entire evidentiary foundation of this case. Everything else is interpretation. Before we reconstruct what happened, we need to understand what the evidence actually is and how much weight each piece can carry. Tier 1 evidence in this case includes the physical state of the tent and campsite, the forensic autopsy reports on all 9 bodies, photographs taken by investigators and recovered from the hikers' own cameras, official investigation documents, and contemporaneous search party records. These are the bedrock. Tier 2 includes corroborated testimony from multiple independent searchers and investigators. Testimony is evidence, but it is not physical evidence. Corroboration raises its weight. Tier 3 consists of single-source claims, which must be used cautiously. And then there is what is not evidence at all: internet speculation, anonymous sources, pattern matching without a causal mechanism, and the absence of records treated as proof of something hidden. 2 logical rules apply throughout. Correlation is not causation. A detail that is unusual is not automatically significant unless it connects to a mechanism. An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we cannot find proof of something does not prove the opposite. The case presents 2 specific anomalies that any explanation must account for. First, the official record cannot explain why 9 experienced hikers simultaneously fled their only shelter into lethal cold, cutting their way out from inside rather than using the entrance, because no documented natural event in the initial investigation adequately accounts for this level of urgency. Second, the record cannot account for the severe blunt force trauma found on 3 of the hikers. The forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies described the chest injuries to Ludmila Dubinina and Alexander Zolotaryov as comparable to the force of a car crash, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol suffered a fatal skull fracture. These injuries are inconsistent with hypothermia, with falls on the terrain where the bodies were found, or with animal attack. The investigation identified no source for this force. Any resolution of this case must explain both the flight and the injuries. Neither alone is sufficient. From the Tier 1 and corroborated Tier 2 evidence, we can establish the following baseline with confidence. The evidence establishes that all 9 hikers arrived at Kholat Syakhl on the evening of February 1 and made camp on the open slope. Photographs and diary entries confirm this. The tent was erected by cutting into the snow to create a flat platform. The evidence establishes that an exit was cut through the tent fabric from the inside, and all 9 people left through this opening, leaving behind warm clothing, boots, food, and equipment. The evidence establishes that 8 or 9 sets of footprints led downhill from the tent toward the edge of a forest roughly 1.5 kilometers away. Searchers described the footprints as showing people walking, not running. The evidence establishes that 2 hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko, were found near a cedar tree at the forest edge. They died of hypothermia. The evidence establishes that 3 hikers, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, were found at points between the cedar tree and the tent, positioned as though they had been trying to return uphill. They died of hypothermia, though Slobodin also had a skull fracture. The evidence establishes that the remaining 4 hikers, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibaut Brignoles, and Alexander Kolevatov, were found in May in a ravine beneath several feet of snow, for months after the others. Dubinina and Zolotaryov died of massive chest trauma. Thibaut Brignoles died of a skull fracture. Kolevatov's cause of death could not be conclusively determined but is consistent with asphyxiation or hypothermia. The evidence establishes that some of these 4 bodies had soft tissue damage, including missing eyes and, in Dubinina's case, a missing tongue. The forensic examiner attributed this to post-mortem decomposition and scavenging by small animals over the months the bodies lay in running water from melting snow. The evidence does not establish what caused the hikers to flee. It does not establish the source of the blunt force trauma. It does not establish that any external human agency, military activity, or paranormal event was involved. Claims about radioactive clothing, orange skin, or gray hair either originate from single sources, have been exaggerated in retelling, or are consistent with mundane explanations such as laboratory contamination or postmortem changes. These claims do not meet the threshold for reliable evidence. What follows is a reconstruction built from this baseline. The record establishes the group reached Kholat Syakhl on February 1, likely in the late afternoon. They chose to camp on the open slope rather than descend into the forest valley, possibly because the forest was too far to reach before dark or because Dyatlov wanted to practice mountain camping techniques. They cut a platform into the snow, pitched the tent, cooked a meal, and settled in for the night. Diary entries and photographs confirm this much. Sometime after dark, something happened. What followed is reconstructed from the physical evidence, the cut tent, the footprints, the positions of the bodies. Something caused the hikers to cut their way out of the tent and flee downhill. They moved toward the forest, the nearest shelter, roughly 1.5 kilometers away. At some point the group fragmented. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko reached the cedar tree first and climbed it, possibly to look back toward the tent. They died there of hypothermia. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin attempted to return to the tent but collapsed from cold before reaching it. The 4th group, injured and unable to climb back up, descended into the ravine where they died. The official investigation in 1959 concluded that the hikers died due to a compelling unknown force. This was not an explanation. It was an acknowledgement that investigators could not identify what had happened. The case was closed. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation and concluded that a slab avalanche was the cause. The evidence they cited included the slope conditions, the positioning of the tent on a cut platform, and the injuries consistent with being struck by a mass of snow and ice. This finding remains disputed, primarily because the slope at the tent site was measured at approximately 15 to 18 degrees, well below the typical minimum of 28 to 30 degrees for slab avalanches. The original investigators also found no evidence of avalanche debris, and the hikers had been at the site for several hours before the incident, which is unusual for avalanche triggers. This brings us to the competing explanations, and I want to be direct with you about what the evidence can and cannot support. The simplest explanation that accounts for both the flight and the injuries is a small, delayed slab avalanche. In 2021, researchers at ETH Zurich published a model in a peer-reviewed journal showing that katabatic winds, which are dense cold air currents flowing downhill, could have deposited significant snow above the tent site on a steeper section of slope. The hikers cutting into the snow to create their platform would have weakened the layer below this deposit. The combination of wind loading and the cut slope could have produced a delayed slab release, hours after the platform was made. The model demonstrated that a slab of this type could generate enough force to cause the observed chest and skull injuries while being small enough to leave no obvious debris by the time searchers arrived weeks later, especially given wind redistribution and subsequent snowfall. This explanation accounts for the flight from the tent, then avalanche striking the tent. Even a small one would create immediate panic and possibly partial burial. Cutting out from inside is consistent with being trapped by snow collapse. It accounts for the injuries. A slab of compacted snow striking sleeping hikers would produce exactly the kind of massive blunt force trauma documented in the autopsies, without the external wounds associated with strikes from rocks or weapons. It accounts for the footprints showing people walking rather than running. They were moving away from the danger zone, not fleeing a predator. And it accounts for why they did not return to the tent. The tent was either buried, damaged, or they feared a second slide. The evidence against this explanation is the slope angle and the absence of visible avalanche debris. The Swiss model addresses both objections. The critical slope was above the tent, not at the tent site itself. And a small slab avalanche on a wind-scoured ridge would leave minimal trace after weeks of weather. The absence of evidence for avalanche is not evidence of absence, particularly when the search occurred 3 weeks later in a mountain environment. Alternative explanations exist. The katabatic wind hypothesis proposes that extreme winds, potentially exceeding hurricane force, made the tent uninhabitable and forced the hikers out. This accounts for the flight but not the injuries, and it struggles to explain why the hikers would cut the tent rather than simply exit through the door. The infrasound theory suggests that wind passing over the mountain produced frequencies below human hearing that induced irrational panic. This is speculative. There is no Tier 1 or Tier 2 evidence supporting it, and no documented case of infrasound causing this kind of behavior in real-world conditions. Military weapons testing has been proposed repeatedly, but no physical evidence of explosions, radiation above background levels, or shrapnel was ever documented at the site. The injuries are blunt force trauma, not blast injuries. Each of these alternatives either fails to account for the documented injuries or requires assumptions unsupported by physical evidence. If the avalanche explanation accounts for the baseline and both documented anomalies, and if it requires fewer assumptions than any alternative, then it is the most supported explanation. This does not mean it is proven. It means it is the explanation best supported by the evidence we have. Several questions remain genuinely open. Exactly what the avalanche looked like, whether it was a single event or multiple smaller ones, whether some hikers were directly struck while others fled in panic, these details may be permanently unknowable. The evidence that would resolve them would be contemporaneous observation, which does not exist, or more detailed forensic examination of the tent and campsite immediately after the event, which the Soviet investigation did not conduct with sufficient rigor. The soft tissue damage to the bodies found in the ravine is almost certainly post-mortem, but the precise sequence of decomposition and scavenging in that specific microenvironment has not been reconstructed. The question of why the hikers camped on the slope rather than descending to the forest is answered by their own diary. They made a choice, possibly influenced by time and weather. It was not an irrational choice, but it was the choice that put them in the path of the event that killed them. The Dyatlov Pass incident is not a mystery that resists explanation because the truth is strange. It resists explanation because the evidence was partial, the investigation was imperfect, and the specific conditions on that slope that night were transient. The mountain has since buried whatever traces remained. A compelling unknown force was the conclusion of investigators who could not see what the evidence was pointing toward. 65 years later, the evidence points toward a small, rare avalanche on a slope most people would not associate with avalanche risk. That is not as dramatic as the alternatives. But the evidence does not care about drama. It cares about mechanism, and force, and what actually happened on that mountain. 9 people died because something struck their tent in the dark, and they ran into the only thing more lethal than what was behind them. That is the tragedy. The evidence suggests it is also the truth.